Well, we made it. Today marks the 8th and final installment of our sermon series on our congregation's spoken affirmation. Over the past 8 weeks, we have covered a considerable amount of theological ground in an attempt to more fully understand the words that we recite together at the end of every Sunday morning worship service. Today, we reach the core and the substance of this affirmation. Today, we discover and realize the full significance of this eloquent catalog of words and ideas. For those of you unfamiliar with the words itself, some of our guests, it is printed on the back of your order of service, and I would invite you to take a look at it if you would like to do so. Last week, as some of you may recall, I momentarily devolved back into an English teacher, and I led us through a brief grammatical analysis of the lines of the affirmation that we have so far studied. And in that analysis, I noted that the first sentence of our affirmation is really just a preamble. It makes 3 foundational declaratory statements about the nature of our church. 1, our doctrine is love. 2, our sacrament is a quest for truth. And 3, our prayer is service. So what follows the preamble is the true essence of this affirmation, which is but one single sentence. Structurally, the sentence is what grammarians call a periodic sentence, meaning that the core independent clause, or the subject and verb, the actual essential guts of the sentence, don't appear until the very end, right near the period. So today, we reach that period, and with it, we see the big reveal. This final line reveals to us that the affirmation we weekly recite is not simply some random list of pretty words and nice ideas. We discover today that these words, that this affirmation is actually a covenant, and that is a big deal. By strict definition, going back to its Latin roots, a covenant is nothing more than a coming together in agreement. But the word covenant, of course, carries with it some very powerful connotations, especially in a religious context. But to fully understand that religious context, we may wish to first look at covenants through a historical and legal lens. Now, covenants and contracts have many, many similarities. They are both essentially agreements between parties, but they also have some very important differences. For example, legal contracts require that the contracting parties exchange something of value called consideration. Exchange of consideration usually takes the form of a quid pro quo arrangement where money is traded for a valuable good or service. Historically, a covenant, unlike a contract, did not require consideration. So this meant that a covenant could simply be the exchange of promises between parties, which even to this day is something that a contract simply cannot be. Now, simply because something of value does not have to change hands in a covenant, that doesn't make it any less important than a contract. But without something of value exchanging hands, people needed to find other ways to express the true seriousness of a covenant. So the establishing of covenants historically, they were often accompanied by some sort of a ritual, perhaps the use of an official seal or the speaking of very special words designed to communicate the solemnity of the agreement being struck between the parties, because a covenant is never to be taken lightly. So today, we can understand a covenant as being a set of solemn promises exchanged between parties. It's a vow, an oath, a swearing to do or not to do something. And that is our big reveal. Every week, we come together and we make solemn promises to each other. We promise to dwell together in peace. We vow to seek knowledge in freedom. We solemnly swear to serve humanity in fellowship. Those are our sacred and solemn oaths to one another. And as you use Well, we've been using covenants like this one for a long, long time. The use of the covenant has been central to our faith, perhaps even the central tenet of our faith going back hundreds of years. It's the reason we call ourselves a covenantal faith as opposed to a creedal faith. As many of you may already know, we Unitarian Universalists are the direct religious descendants of the Puritans. They're basically our grandparents in the faith on the Unitarian side of the family. Now that's understandably a bit of a shock for people the first time they hear it. After all, we UUs bear little theological resemblance to the Puritans. In fact, I'm sure there are several Puritan ministers who would be spinning in their graves right now if they could see what their UU grandchildren were up to these days. But though we bear little resemblance to the Puritans theologically, our congregational polity, that is, the way that we organize ourselves and recognize authority within and among our congregations, this has gone largely unchanged for hundreds of years. And the polity of the great free church tradition that we share with our Puritan forebears is based on the idea of the covenant. I'm going to switch from being an English teacher as I was last week to being a history teacher this week. And this brief history I'm going to outline for you comes primarily from the research of UU theologian, the Reverend Alice Blair Wesley. And if you find this at all interesting, I highly recommend that you go and read more of her work, especially the 2000 Men's Lectures. All right, so here we are in the early 1600s in England. And in the early 1600s in England, there's a group of people called the Puritans. They are not particularly popular for several reasons, but that's not the focus today. Around this time in history, the Church of England is quite powerful, and there's no real separation of church and state. Following the beginning of the Protestant Reformation that began a few decades before, some educated English folk began reading and studying the Bibles for themselves, instead of simply listening to what the bishops and the curates told them that the Bible said. So around this time, there's a lot of unauthorized biblical preaching happening in England, and people begin listening to these educated but unauthorized rogue preachers. And then the people would begin talking amongst themselves in response, and they began realizing that spiritual community could, and maybe should, look very different from the way that the Church of England was doing it. Now, the Church of England didn't much like all this rebellious preaching and talking, so they used the power of the state to crush it. So then these folks, these so-called Puritans, they hatch a plot. They create something called the Massachusetts Bay Company. The Massachusetts Bay Company was essentially a conspiracy of well-educated but lay people who wanted to establish free churches in the New World, free of government entanglement, free from the authority of bishops, and modeled after the church organization they found in the Bible. The Massachusetts Bay Company was ostensibly a for-profit joint stock trading company that received a charter from the King of England to establish a colony in the New World, but it was basically a front. The real purpose of the company wasn't to make money. It was to establish a radical Puritan religious experiment thousands of miles away from the king and the bishops of the Church of England. It was an opportunity for the Puritans to try to create their own spiritual and religious community as they saw fit in complete freedom from the Church of England. So the Puritans were essentially a bunch of highly intelligent, not particularly popular, talkative, fiercely independent, heretical rebels. Now do you see the family resemblance? In the 1630s, some 20,000 Puritans end up settling in what would become modern-day New England. They form little towns, and in the towns they form churches. And these local churches are amazing experiments in religious freedom. They're like little spiritual laboratories. The Puritans were no longer under the religious authority of the Church of England. There was no bishop there to tell them how to do church. So they came together, they talked, they studied, and most importantly, they crafted covenants detailing and explaining how they would function as a spiritual community. Thus were born Congregationalist churches in the New World, from which Unitarians were later born. Because there was no external authority over these free churches, because these Puritans did not answer to a pope or a bishop at the seat of a diocese thousands of miles away, each congregation was its own religious entity. It answered to itself. So the rules, the norms, the expectations, and the culture of each individual church was established by the individual members of the congregation via the covenant. And in years following, these congregations came together and made another covenant among themselves. This came to be known as the Cambridge Platform, which has served as a model for the relationship between UU congregations within our association. So you see, Unitarian Universalism is a proudly covenantal faith. It is a faith based on freedom and relationships. Our community is bound together by solemn promises, promises made amongst equals, where the equal parties agree freely, without coercion, on all the terms. We choose our own values, we elect our own leaders. This is in contrast to a creedal faith, where church members are bound by a common mental assent to speculative metaphysical propositions, often delivered by a distant religious authority, perhaps a pope, a bishop, or an infallible text written by some long-dead prophet filled with cider house rules. UU minister Tom Owen Toll notes, covenanting refers not to a joint theology, but to a shared process, not to tenets of faith, but to bonds of faithfulness. Through our shared process of covenant, we, the members of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Jacksonville, we voluntarily bind ourselves. We bind our behaviors, we bind our attitudes. We pledge to interact with each other in particular ways. We pledge to recognize shared values, and we promise to strive to embody those values. And in doing so, we sacrifice part of our individual freedom for the good of the community. And by making these commitments publicly every week, we willingly make ourselves accountable to each other. There used to be a pernicious little lie about UU churches that you might still hear repeated to this day. The lie goes like this: UUs can believe anything they want and do anything they want. That is flatly untrue. If you ever hear someone repeat this lie, please make sure to stop and lovingly correct them. We are not the anything goes church. The whole purpose of a covenant is to promise to act in a certain way or refrain from acting in a certain way with other people. And I would argue that the substantive promises that we make to each other in this covenant, our affirmation, and in our membership covenant, those promises are very hard to keep. It takes dedication. It takes hard work. It takes grit to be a UU. Don't let anyone fool you or tell you otherwise. Building the beloved community in the UU way requires discipline, and it requires sacrifice. And you know what? We will fail. I promise you that. We will fail, all of us, to live up to these promises at some point or another. How do I know with such certainty? Because we are all human beings. But also, because we are human, after we fail, we can choose to seek forgiveness from those we have failed. We can choose to make reparations if necessary. We can choose to return to covenant, recommitting ourselves to our shared aspirational ideals. That process, which we have all partaken of, is a central aspect of the human experience. As existentialist philosopher and theologian Martin Buber noted, human beings are nature's only promise-making, promise-breaking, and promise-renewing creatures. And it is our responsibility as members of a community, when covenant is broken, to seek healing and to invite a return. We UUs echo the words of Rumi, the Sufi poet, prophet, and mystic, who said, "Though you have broken your vow 1,000 times, come, yet again, come." Like so many of you, I love this congregation's tradition of taking hands at the end of every service and publicly and proudly reaffirming our commitment to these shared promises. In fact, I would go so far as to say it is the single most important element of worship that we all engage in every Sunday. More important than the music, the hymns, the meditation, the giving, or the sermon. It is central to our community. It is central to our faith. And I'm going to use an analogy, one that makes sense to me, which of course is no guarantee that it will make sense to any of you. But this analogy resonates with me because of my background, and perhaps it will resonate with some of you. For me, I think of our recitation, our spoken affirmation that we recite at the end of every service. I think of it as our own Unitarian Universalist expression of Holy Communion. The religious practice of communion actually predates Christianity, but it is the Christian expression of communion that I am personally most familiar with, and so it is the Christian expression of communion that I will use in this analogy. Most Christians understand communion as a solemn ritual in which the followers of Jesus come together to celebrate and remember a new testament, testament being just a fancy word for covenant, which was instituted by Jesus. Communion is a process that intimately connects Christians to God through the simple act of feeding one another bread and wine. The bread and wine begin the ritual as ordinary physical elements, but through the ritual, these ordinary elements are transformed into something extraordinary, according to Christian theology, the blood and body of Christ. And through the extraordinary gift of that bread and wine, grace is imparted to those who partake and believe. Similarly, the recitation of our affirmation is a solemn ritual we perform every week in which we come together to celebrate and remember our promises, a covenant that we have instituted ourselves. It's a process that intimately connects each of us to one another, for we reach out and take hands physically touching our neighbors, thus symbolizing the loving bonds of community that connect each of us through this covenant. Through this simple act, we feed one another. We nourish each other with love and compassion. And this simple act of committing ourselves to the promises of this covenant, it transforms us. We move from being ordinary individuals into becoming an extraordinary, beloved community, far greater than the sum of its individual parts. And I can't speak for all of you, but I know that after I take hands and recite and remember these words, after I recommit myself to these promises in the presence of my church family, I feel inspired and empowered to go out into the world and actually try to live the ideals represented in these words. That sense of empowerment, that sense of inspiration, that is a grace. That's why I believe this ritual is the most powerful thing we do as a community every Sunday, and it is why I believe we should keep on promising. I love this charge from UU minister David Blanchard. He writes, "Do more than simply keep the promises made in your vow. Do something more. Keep promising. As time passes, keep promising new things, deeper things, vaster things, yet unimagined things. Promises that will be needed to fill the expanses of time and of love. Keep promising." Indeed, we need powerful promises to fill the vast expanses of time and the vast expanses of love. So, as the people of a truly covenantal faith, let us all keep on promising. Blessed be.